Restless dragon hatchlings were reported lost for weeks. They found them sleeping on his chest. Vithara Station was not a quiet place. It was never meant to be. It sat in the upper orbit of a gas giant called Corsen, a planet so large that it made most ships look like dust. The station itself was enormous, a spinning ring of metal and glass that stretched nearly 4 kilometers from one end to the other. Dozens of species passed through it every single day. Merchants, diplomats, soldiers, scientists, and wanderers from more worlds than most people could name. The corridors hummed with languages that had no words for things like weekend or take it easy. The air always smelled like something burning, something sweet, and something else entirely that nobody could ever quite identify. Humanity had been a part of the Galactic Compact for just over 11 years. In the grand scale of things, that was nothing. Most of the species aboard Vithara Station had been traveling the stars for centuries before humans had figured out basic flight. The older species were polite about it, mostly. But polite did not mean warm. Humans were tolerated the way you tolerate a new neighbor, with a stiff nod and the quiet hope that they do not cause too much trouble. Cole Navarro had been stationed on Vithara for 8 months, and in that time he had caused exactly 0 trouble. He was 28 years old, originally from a small town in New Mexico, and he worked as a cargo liaison and junior diplomatic aide for the human contingent aboard the station. His job was simple on paper. He helped move goods, translated basic requests, and sat in on lower-level meetings so that the senior diplomats could focus on the bigger problems. In reality, his job was whatever needed doing that nobody else wanted to do. He had never been the kind of person who needed to be in the center of things. Cole was quiet in a way that was hard to explain. Not shy, not cold, just still. He moved slowly through the busy corridors without bumping into anyone. He sat in the observation deck for hours at a time, watching the gas giant turn below the station, reading a paperback book he had already read 3 times. He hummed to himself while he worked, low, soft melodies that he had learned from his grandmother when he was young. He never seemed rushed. He never seemed bothered. Most of the alien species aboard the station found this deeply unsettling. Stillness, for many of them, was either a sign of illness or a sign that a predator was about to strike. A creature that sat that quietly in open space, in the middle of a busy transit hub, and showed no signs of fear or urgency, that was strange. That was the kind of behavior that set off old, deep alarms in species that had evolved on worlds with teeth in the shadows. Cole was completely unaware of any of this. He just liked the view. His direct supervisor was Nora Callum, a woman in her late 30s who had spent most of her adult life in diplomatic work. She was sharp and careful and very good at managing the fragile thread of humanity's standing in the compact. She had a habit of reviewing mission briefings 3 times before any meeting and carrying 2 backup communication devices at all times. She trusted Cole to do his job correctly, which he always did, and she did not fully trust him to understand the political weight of his job, which he often did not seem to. The station's human medical officer was a man named Ben Adler. He made bad jokes at good moments, remembered everyone's name, and was quietly one of the best diagnosticians on the station, despite the fact that he usually looked like he had just woken up from a nap. He and Cole had become something close to friends, mostly because they were the 2 humans on the station who seemed least concerned with impressing anyone. The Vrakai arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in the station's internal calendar. There were 7 of them. Their ship, long, dark, and shaped like a curved bone, docked at the primary diplomatic bay with a sound like a deep breath being let out slowly. When the bay doors opened, most of the station personnel standing nearby took an involuntary step back. The Vrakai were enormous. They moved on 4 of their 6 limbs. The other 2 folded close to their bodies like compressed wings. Their scales were layered and dark, shifting between deep green and black depending on the light. And each one had a crest of bioluminescent tissue that ran from the top of the skull down the length of the spine. When the crests were lit, pulsing with slow color, the HFY looked like something between a dragon and a living storm. They were one of the oldest species in the compact. They had been traveling the stars before most current civilizations had names. They were respected in the way that very few things in the galaxy were respected. Not out of obligation, but out of something that felt closer to awe. Their lead delegate was called SleHFY. She was taller than any of the others, and her crest burned a steady deep gold. She moved with the kind of patience that came from knowing, without question, that nothing in the room was going to threaten her. She was aboard Vethara Station for a cultural ceremony. The details were complicated and mostly handled above Cole's clearance level. What he did know, because Nora had briefed the entire human team, was that SleHFY had brought something extraordinary with her. 3 HFY hatchlings. Young ones. Small by HFY standards, which still meant they were roughly the size of large dogs, with wings not yet fully grown, and crests still learning to hold color for more than a few seconds at a time. They were called Keth. And across the compact, Keth were known for one thing above everything else. They did not settle. HFY hatchlings were born with nervous systems tuned to the extreme. Every sound was loud to them. Every smell was overwhelming. Every new face was a potential threat. Outside of a sealed, carefully regulated nest end with controlled pheromone levels and familiar warmth, Keth simply did not calm down. They moved constantly, made noise constantly, and had been known to claw through reinforced wall panels when overstimulated. Every species in the compact that had ever encountered one agreed on this fact without exception. Bringing them to a transit station was an act of enormous spiritual significance for the HFY. It meant something deep in their culture, a statement of faith, of trust in the compact, of openness. It was also, as several station engineers privately noted, a logistical nightmare. The hatchlings were housed in a specially prepared habitat pod in the diplomatic wing. The pod was sealed, climate-controlled, and monitored at all hours. SleHFY checked on them every few hours. The spiritual attendants she had brought with her rotated shifts to stay near the pod at all times. For the first few days, everything was as expected. The Keth were loud and restless and difficult. They scratched at the walls. They didn't sleep for long. The attendants looked tired. Cole passed the diplomatic wing twice a day on his normal route. He never stopped. He just walked by, slow and unhurried, sometimes humming under his breath. On the 4th day, one of the habitat pod's door sensors logged a brief anomaly. A door seal reading that didn't quite match the expected pattern. It lasted 3 seconds and then corrected itself. Nobody flagged it. Nobody thought to. Restless dragon hatchlings were reported lost for weeks. They found them sleeping on his chest. The first week passed without anything that felt like a warning. The Keth were difficult, the way everyone had expected them to be. The spiritual attendants rotated their shifts with the quiet exhaustion of people who had signed up for something hard and were simply getting through it. SleHFY visited the habitat pod each morning and each evening. She would stand at the transparent wall and watch her hatchlings for a long time without speaking. Her crest would pulse slowly, deep gold, fading to amber and back again. Nobody on the human team was quite sure what that meant emotionally, but Nora had advised everyone to leave the ambassador alone during those visits, and not to stare. Cole did not stare. He passed the wing twice a day, and kept his eyes on the corridor ahead of him, the way he always did. The door sensor anomalies continued. A 3-second gap in the seal reading on day 4. A 5-second gap on day 6. A longer one, nearly 12 seconds, on day 8. Each time, the readings corrected themselves before the automated system could escalate the flag. The station's maintenance team logged them as minor calibration errors and added them to the weekly review list, which nobody read until Friday, and Friday kept getting pushed. On day 9, one of the spiritual attendants noticed that the smallest Keth, the one with an uneven crest that flickered more than it glowed, seemed calmer in the morning than it had been the night before. It was still restless. It still moved too fast and made too much noise. But its crest was cycling with slightly more color than usual, and it had eaten its morning portion cleanly instead of scattering it across the floor. The attendant noted this in her daily log, and then did not think too much about it, because the other two Keth immediately began wrestling each other into the wall, and she had more urgent things to deal with. By the end of the second week, all 3 Keth were displaying small but measurable signs of reduced agitation in the mornings. Not calm, not even close to calm, but less frantic. The attendants mentioned it to SleHFY. The ambassador looked at her hatchlings for a long time and said nothing. Her crest had gone a shade deeper than usual, a color that the attendants recognized but did not name aloud, because it was the color she wore when she was thinking about something she did not yet have words for. Nora caught a fragment of that conversation through the station's translation feed and made a note to ask about it later. She had 17 other things on her list for that day, and the note stayed a note. Cole had started taking slightly longer lunch breaks. He ate in his quarters instead of the common hall, which was not unusual for him. He had always preferred quiet spaces. Ben noticed it after the 3rd day in a row and mentioned it once, and Cole said he had just been tired. Ben believed him, because Cole did in fact often look tired. He had one of those faces that carried a kind of permanent, gentle exhaustion that had nothing to do with how much sleep he had gotten. Nobody thought to connect any of these things. The disappearance happened on a Thursday. SleHFY arrived at the habitat pod for her morning visit and found it empty. The pod was sealed from the inside. The environmental controls were still running. The food dispenser had not been triggered. The walls were intact. The ventilation seals were intact. There were no claw marks on any surface. There were no signs of distress, no overturned objects, no damage, no indication of a struggle or a panic. The Keth were simply gone, with the same calm thoroughness as if they had never been there at all. SleHFY stood at the entrance of the empty pod for 40 seconds. Her crest went completely dark. She did not shout. She did not move. She stood very still, and that stillness was somehow worse than any sound she could have made. The spiritual attendant on duty saw her face and triggered the station alert before SleHFY had even turned around. The lockdown went into effect within minutes. Every corridor sealed. Every docking bay froze. The station's population of nearly 2,000 beings from 37 different species was stopped in place, while security drones swept every deck, from the outer ring to the central core. Nora was out of bed and in the command center within 8 minutes, still pulling her jacket on. Ben was paged from the medical bay and arrived to find 3 different species of security officer arguing about scan protocols in a language that kept switching mid-sentence. SleHFY had entered what the Vrakai called a grief-fury state. It was a biological response, not a choice. Her body temperature had dropped 3 degrees, her crest had gone fully black, and the bioluminescent tissue along her spine had stopped cycling entirely. She stood in the center of the diplomatic wing, looking like a storm that had decided to take a shape. The compact security chief, a tall insectoid being named Krethval, kept a careful distance and communicated with her only through a translator drone. The Vrakai, Nora had explained to the entire human team during the emergency briefing, considered the loss of Keth during a ceremonial voyage to be among the worst spiritual events that could happen to a delegation. It did not just mean the hatchlings were missing. It meant, in Vrakai belief, that the universe itself had rejected the purpose of the voyage, that the compact had failed the delegation at the deepest possible level, that the ceremony, and possibly the diplomatic relationship it was meant to strengthen, was in ruin. Nora said this with the flat, careful voice she used when she was frightened, but could not afford to show it. Every species aboard the station knew what the Vrakai meant to the compact. Losing their goodwill was not something that could be fixed with an apology and a committee meeting. It was the kind of damage that lasted generations. The thermal scan teams reported back within the hour. They had found no trace of 3 Vrakai hatchlings anywhere on the station. What they had found, in the lower cargo residential wing, was a persistent and confusing heat signature that kept disrupting their calibration readings. It was too warm to be a mechanical system, and too large to be a single life form. The scan team flagged it as a probable environmental heater malfunction and moved on, because the calibration error meant they could not get a clean reading from that section, and there were 40 other sections still to check. The search continued through the day and into the night cycle. Species that had been aboard the station for decades said they had never seen a full lockdown last this long. The Keth were not found. Cole had not reported for his shift that morning. Nora tried to reach him twice by comm. No answer. She assumed he had slept through the alert, which was honestly something she could imagine him doing, and flagged it to deal with after the crisis had settled. By the end of the second day, it had not settled. The Keth were still gone. SleHFY had not eaten. Her crest had not lit once. Nora sent Ben to check on Cole. Ben walked down to the lower cargo residential wing, found Cole's quarters, and tried the door. It was unlocked, which was not unusual. Cole rarely locked his door. Ben pushed it open slowly and looked inside. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he very carefully pulled the door shut, leaned his back against the wall in the corridor, and stared at the ceiling for a moment. He reached for his comm and sent Nora a message that said only, "Found them. Do not bring security. Come quietly. Bring the ambassador." Restless dragon hatchlings were reported lost for weeks. They found them sleeping on his chest. Ben's message sat on Nora's screen for 4 seconds before she read it twice. She read it a third time. Then she put her comm in her pocket, told the security coordinator she needed 10 minutes, and walked down the corridor at a pace that was not quite running, but was close enough that 2 junior staff members stepped out of her way without being asked. Getting SleHFY to come quietly was the harder part. The ambassador had not moved from the diplomatic wing in nearly 2 days. She stood near the entrance of the empty habitat pod, the way a person stands near something they have lost, not looking at it directly, but never fully turning away either. Her crest was still dark. Her spiritual attendants stood behind her in silence, their own crests dimmed to almost nothing out of respect for her grief. Nora approached alone. She stood at a respectful distance and spoke in a low voice through the translator unit clipped to her collar. She said that something had been found, that she could not explain it fully in words, and that she was asking the ambassador to trust her enough to walk with her to the lower residential wing. She said please. She meant it. SleHFY looked at her for a long time. The ambassador's eyes were gold, with narrow black pupils that contracted slowly when they focused. She had the kind of gaze that made most species feel like they were being read rather than looked at. Then, without speaking, she turned and walked in the direction Nora had come from. Nora let out a breath and followed. Ben was still in the corridor when they arrived. He had not moved from his spot against the wall. He looked calm, in the way that people look calm when they are actively working to stay that way. When he saw SleHFY, he straightened up and gave a small, respectful nod, which the ambassador did not return, not out of rudeness, but because she was looking at the door behind him. Ben held up one hand slowly. He kept his voice very low. He said that what was on the other side of the door was fine, that nothing was wrong, that everyone was safe and unhurt, and he needed them to understand that before he opened it, because what they were about to see was going to look strange, and the most important thing was to not make any sudden sounds or movements when they first saw it. Nora looked at him steadily and nodded. SleHFY was already still, in the way only very large, very old creatures can be still. Total and absolute and without any effort at all. Ben turned the handle and pushed the door open slowly, just wide enough. He stepped aside. The station's night cycle lighting came through the viewport in long pale amber lines that crossed the floor and climbed partway up the far wall. The air inside was warm, noticeably warmer than the corridor, and it carried a smell that was hard to name. Something like heated stone, something faintly electric, something deep and old, like the inside of a place that had been lived in for a long time. Cole was lying on his bunk, on his back. He was fully dressed, boots still on, jacket still on, one arm resting flat at his side. His breathing was slow and steady, the kind of breathing that belongs to someone in deep, genuine sleep. His paperback book was sitting closed on the small table beside the bed, a folded receipt tucked in as a bookmark about 2/3 of the way through. Across his chest, draped over his shoulders, curled under his chin, and tangled around each other in a loose, warm knot of scales and wings and softly glowing light, were all three Keth. They were completely still. The largest one was coiled from Cole's left shoulder down across his ribs. Its tail curled loosely over his legs. Its crest was pulsing in long, slow waves, deep blue fading to green and back again, the rhythm so steady and unhurried that it looked like breathing. The second Keth was tucked along his right side, one small wing half open and draped across his stomach like a blanket, its angular head resting on his forearm. Its crest cycled the same slow blue-green, perfectly in time with the first. The third one, the smallest, the one with the uneven crest, was pressed directly against Cole's throat. Its flat, broad head was tucked under his chin, fitted into the curve of his jaw as if that exact space had been made for it. Its crest, which had barely managed more than a flicker since the delegation arrived, was cycling steady and full, slow pulses of gold and deep amber, over and over, without interruption. Nora stood in the doorway and could not speak. She had read the compact files on Vraki Hatchlings during the pre-arrival briefing. She had read the behavioral notes, the environmental requirements, the documented history of every attempt any species had ever made to calm a Keth outside of a regulated nest den. The files were clear and consistent. It could not be done. The Keth's nervous system simply did not allow for it. Outside of a sealed, pheromone-controlled, thermally calibrated nest environment, the hatchlings could not reach a deep sleep state. The biology did not permit it. The biology was currently sleeping on a cargo aid from New Mexico. Behind her, she heard SleHFY make a sound. It was not loud. It was a very low sound, deep in the ambassador's chest, almost below the range of human hearing. It was the kind of sound that did not need a translation file, because it did not belong to language. It was older than language. Cole stirred. His eyes opened, just one at first, then the other, slow and unhurried. He looked at the doorway. He looked at Nora. He looked past her at SleHFY. Then he looked down at the three Keth on his chest with the expression of a man who was very aware of the situation and had been hoping it would resolve itself before anyone came looking. He raised one finger slowly to his lips. Nora nodded. Once, the only sound in the room was the slow, even pull of Cole's breathing, and the faint, soft pulse of three bioluminescent crests cycling gold and blue in the dark. Then the smallest Keth, perhaps sensing the new presence in the doorway, shifted slightly. Its head turned a fraction toward the door. Its crest flickered, one brief flash of brighter light, and then it pressed its face back under Cole's chin, and went still again. SleHFY stood in the doorway, with her crest still dark, absolutely motionless, and watched her hatchlings sleep on a human's chest, in a dim room on a transit station, at the edge of a gas giant's orbit. After a long time, she took one slow step backward, into the corridor. Then another. Ben pulled the door gently shut. The four of them stood in the corridor in silence. One of the station's ventilation cycles clicked on somewhere overhead, and hummed quietly, and clicked off again. Nora looked at SleHFY. The ambassador's crest, dark for 2 full days, had begun to change. It was not gold yet. It was not any color yet. But it was not dark anymore. It was the very first edge of something returning. A faint, deep warmth, moving slowly through the bioluminescent tissue from the base of the skull upward, like an ember catching light. Nora thought of 100 things to say, and said none of them. Ben said, very quietly, that he was going to need someone to explain to him how this happened, and that he was going to need to sit down first. Nobody disagreed with him. Restless dragon hatchlings were reported lost for weeks. They found them sleeping on his chest. Word traveled faster than anyone wanted it to. By the time Ben had sat down on the corridor floor and gotten back up again, 2 of SleHFY's spiritual attendants had appeared at the far end of the hallway. They had followed the ambassador, keeping a quiet distance the way they always did, and now they stood very still, with their crests pulsing in fast, uneven bursts, the Rakai equivalent of someone trying very hard to process something that their brain was not ready to process. Nora saw them and made a decision. She walked to the middle of the corridor and held both hands up, palms out, which was the closest thing to a universal gesture for "please stop and wait" that the compact had ever agreed on. She turned to Ben and spoke very quietly and very quickly. She told him to go back in, wake Cole up slowly, and get him out into the corridor. She said to tell Cole not to make any sudden movements, not to raise his voice, and to bring the Keth with him if they were still attached. She said that last part in the same flat tone she used for all instructions, as if telling someone to carry 3 dragon hatchlings out of a room was a normal sentence. Ben looked at her for a moment. Then he turned around and went back in. He was gone for about 4 minutes. The corridor was very quiet. SleHFY stood with her back straight and her crest slowly brightening, not fully lit, but moving steadily in that direction, like a fire getting its first real air. The 2 attendants had not moved. Nora had not moved. Nobody spoke. The door opened. Cole came out slowly, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of a man carrying something that could not be dropped. He was blinking against the corridor light. His hair was pressed flat on one side from sleeping, and his jacket had been pulled sideways slightly by the weight on his shoulders. He looked, in almost every possible way, like a person who had just been woken up and had not fully caught up to the situation yet. The 3 Keth were still on him. The largest one had shifted up to his right shoulder and was draped across the back of his neck, with its chin resting on his collarbone, looking out at the corridor with slow, drowsy eyes. The second was tucked under his left arm, held loosely against his ribs, the way a person carries a rolled blanket. It blinked once at the attendants, and then closed its eyes again. The smallest one had not moved at all. It was still pressed against Cole's throat, still cycling that slow, steady gold, still seemingly unaware or unconcerned that it was now in a lit corridor with 5 other beings watching it. The 2 attendants made sounds that their translator units did not convert. Some things did not translate. Cole looked at the small crowd in the hallway. He looked at SleHFY. His expression did several things very quickly. Recognition, a kind of careful respect, and then a look that could only be described as the face of someone preparing to be in a significant amount of trouble. He said good morning. He said it to SleHFY first, with a small respectful nod, and then to Nora, and then to Ben, who had come out behind him and was now leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. SleHFY looked at him. Her gaze moved from his face, to the keth against his throat, to the one under his arm, to the one across his shoulder, and back to his face again. She was very still. Her crest had reached a steady, deep amber now. Not quite gold, but close. Warm. She asked him, through the translator unit at her collar, how long. Cole thought about it carefully. He said that the smallest one had come in first, about a week and a half ago. He said he had woken up in the night and found it sitting on his chest, looking at him. He said he had not moved, because it seemed like moving would startle it, so he had just lain still and waited to see what it would do. He said it had eventually gone to sleep, and that he had gone back to sleep too, and that in the morning it was gone before he woke up. He said the second one showed up 2 nights later, then the third. He said after the first week, all 3 of them were coming every night, and staying longer each time. He said he had figured that someone from the delegation would notice they were missing and come looking, and he had not wanted to cause a problem by reporting it himself, because he was not sure what the right protocol was and did not want to do something wrong. There was a silence in the corridor. Nora opened her mouth and then closed it again. Ben looked at the ceiling. SleHFY's crest pulsed once, very bright, and then settled back to its deep amber glow. She asked Cole, very carefully, what he had done to make them stay. Cole thought about this for a moment. He said he had not really done anything. He said he had tried to keep his breathing even because quick movements seemed to make them twitchy. He said he had kept reading his book when they were awake, because it gave him something quiet to do that did not involve looking at them directly, which he had noticed they did not like. He said sometimes when they got restless in the night, he had hummed a little, low and slow, because it was the only thing he could think of that might help. SleHFY asked him to show her what he meant by that. Cole paused. He glanced at Nora, who gave him a look that said, "Please just do it." He looked back at the ambassador. Then he looked down at the smallest keth against his throat, took a slow breath, and began to hum. It was a simple melody, low and unhurried. It moved through the corridor like something warm through cool air, not loud enough to fill the space, but present enough that everyone in it could feel it. It was an old song, something his grandmother had sung to him when he was small and could not sleep, in a kitchen that smelled like dried peppers and wood smoke, in a house that had stood for 100 years in the high desert. It did not need any. The smallest keth went completely still the moment he started. Its crest, which had been cycling its usual steady gold, slowed to almost nothing. A long, deep pulse, then another, each one slower and warmer than the last. It pressed its face harder against Cole's throat. Its eyes, which had been half open, closed fully. One of the spiritual attendants sat down on the corridor floor. Not because she was tired, she simply needed to sit down. SleHFY watched her youngest keth sleep against the throat of a human cargo aide for a long moment. Her crest had gone full gold, not warm gold, not amber, full, deep, brilliant gold, the color she wore when something had shifted in the world in a way that could not be shifted back. She said something in Old Verkai that the translator unit did not catch. The attendant on the floor said it softly again, like a confirmation. Nora looked at Ben. Ben looked at Nora. Neither of them knew what the words meant yet, but they both understood, without needing a translation, that whatever had just happened in this corridor was not a small thing. Cole stopped humming and looked around at everyone. He asked, in a perfectly sincere voice, whether the keth were going to have to go back to the habitat pod now, and if so, whether someone could make sure the temperature in there was a little warmer, because they had seemed to sleep better when the room was warm. Nora put her face in her hands, not because she was upset. She was not upset at all. She just needed a moment that nobody could see her face, because she was smiling, and she was not entirely sure it was appropriate yet. Ben patted Cole on the shoulder, carefully, mindful of the hatchling draped across it, and told him that he was going to have a very long day. Cole nodded like this was reasonable, and asked if there was any coffee. Restless dragon hatchlings were reported lost for weeks. They found them sleeping on his chest. The story was all over Vethera Station before the morning shift ended. It did not spread the way rumors usually spread, through whispers and exaggeration and details added along the way. It spread quietly, person to person, species to species, in the careful and slightly stunned tone of people sharing something they were not entirely sure they believed, even though they had been told it was true. A human? 3 keth, 2 weeks. Sleeping. Most species who heard it said something like, "That is not possible," and the person telling them said, "Yes, that is what everyone said," and then there was usually a long pause before anyone spoke again. Nora spent the first half of the day in the station director's office, going through the full sequence of events, the door sensor logs, the thermal scan interference, the missed comm calls, all of it, and explaining as clearly and as calmly as she could that no protocol had been deliberately broken, that her aide had not intentionally concealed the hatchlings, and that the entire situation had essentially happened to Cole rather than because of him. The station director, a broad, gray-skinned being from a species that communicated primarily through color shifts in its skin, turned a very deep and unreadable shade of blue for most of the meeting. Nora took this as a sign that the conversation was going about as well as could be expected. Cole, meantime, was sitting in the small common room just off the diplomatic wing, drinking the coffee Ben had eventually found for him, with all 3 keth still arranged across him in various states of drowsy satisfaction. A junior compact security officer had come to take his formal statement, and had lasted about 3 minutes before becoming too distracted by the keth to finish his questions. Ben had gently suggested the officer come back later, and had sent him off with a sympathetic look. The spiritual attendants came and went throughout the morning. They did not try to take the hatchlings back to the habitat pod. They did not seem entirely sure what to do, which for beings who had devoted their lives to Vrakai ceremonial tradition was itself a significant thing. They stood near the doorway of the common room, and watched and spoke to each other in low voices, and occasionally wrote things down in the long, narrow record books they carried in their robes. Sivith Kara came in the afternoon. She came alone, which was unusual. She was never without at least one attendant nearby. She walked into the common room and sat down across from Cole, with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had decided something and was now simply carrying it out. Her crest was full gold. It had not dimmed once since the corridor that morning. She told Cole that she wanted to explain something to him. She spoke slowly and let the translator unit work between each sentence, so that nothing was lost. She told him that among the Vrakai there was a word, Veth Solkai. She said it the old way, the way it was said in ceremony, and the sound of it was long and low and filled the small room in a way that ordinary words did not. She said it meant in the closest human translation, the one the young chose. She told him that in Vrakai history, across thousands of years of recorded tradition, a Veth Solkai was always a Vrakai elder, always someone whose spirit had been made quiet and deep through decades of living, someone the hatchlings could sense before they could see, a stillness so complete that the Keth's nervous systems recognized it as safe the way a body recognizes warmth. She paused. She looked at Cole the way she had looked at him in the corridor, reading rather than seeing. She said that in all of recorded Vrakai history, the word had never been given to a member of another species. She said this not as a limitation or a rule, but as a simple fact, the way you state that something has never happened before, when it truly never has. Then she told him that it was being given to him now. Cole was quiet for a moment. The largest keth shifted on his shoulder, and he reached up without thinking and steadied it with one hand, the way you steady something you have been carrying long enough that the gesture has become automatic. He looked at SleHFY, and he looked at the words she had given him, as though he was turning it over carefully to make sure he understood its weight before he said anything about it. He said thank you. He said it simply, without performance, the way he said most things. He said that he was not sure he had done anything worthy of it, but that he was grateful, and he would try to be. SleHFY said that was exactly the right answer. Her crest pulsed once, deep, full, brilliant, and she stood and left the room. Ben was in the doorway 2 seconds later. He had clearly been listening from the corridor, and was not even slightly sorry about it. He sat down across from Cole, and looked at him for a long moment. He asked Cole if he understood what had just happened. Cole said he thought so, mostly. Ben told him that the Vrakai had just handed humanity something that no species had ever received from them before. That SleHFY had not done this quietly or privately. She had done it here, on a station full of 37 species, in the middle of a diplomatic voyage, in a way that every compact member present would report back to their own people. He said that 1,000 years from now, when humans were fully established in the compact, and nobody remembered all the careful politics and fragile negotiations that had gotten them there, somebody was going to write about this day, about a tired young man from New Mexico, who lay still in a dark room and hummed an old song, and accidentally did something that no diplomat, soldier, or scientist had ever managed to do. Cole looked down at the smallest keth under his chin. Its crest was cycling its slow, steady gold. It was asleep again. He said that he was mostly just glad they were all right. Ben laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes out when something is both very funny and very true at the same time. The news reached the wider compact within the week. It traveled through the station's outgoing comm logs and through the personal messages of every species aboard Vathara. And it moved from there the way all significant things move, steadily and without stopping. Species that had filed humanity under manageable and mostly harmless began pulling those files back out and looking at them again. Not with fear, with something more complicated than fear, with the particular unease of a person who realizes they have been making an assumption about someone for a long time, and the assumption may have been wrong. The Vrakai were one of the oldest voices in the compact. When they spoke, other species listened. What they had said, clearly and publicly and without ambiguity, was that the young, who cannot be lied to, who cannot be impressed, who go only where something in them says it is safe, had chosen a human. That meant something. Every species in the compact knew it meant something, even the ones who wanted it not to. Nora found Cole 3 days later, sitting in the observation deck in the usual spot, book in his lap, watching the gas giant turn. The smallest keth, which Ben had started calling Pip, a name the attendants were still adjusting to, was curled on the seat beside him with its chin on his knee. Nora sat down next to him and did not say anything for a while. Then she asked how he was doing. Cole said he was good. He said the view was nice today. He said Pip had eaten a full portion that morning on her own, without any encouragement, which he seemed genuinely pleased about. Nora looked out at the great slow turning of the planet below them, and thought about everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks, and everything it was going to mean for years to come. She said yes, the view was nice. Some things, it turned out, did not need any more words than that.